so much faith in digital technologies that at the beginning of Arab Spring, a young Egyptian couple, they named their newborn baby daughter Facebook, you will remember. And 6 months later, a family in Israel, they named their third child Like. So I think about those two youngsters a lot, you know, Facebook in Egypt and Like in Israel. What's their life like? What kind of a world have we given them now that they're teenagers? So fast forward from that age of optimism, we have swung into the age of pessimism, angst, fear, uncertainty, the possibility of another pandemic as the climate crisis is unfolding in front of us. Very quickly, if I may add this, of course, the past generations have gone through lots of difficulties, right? We talk about First World War, Second World War, poverty, inflation, depression, but they always retained the belief that tomorrow was going to be better than yesterday. When I look at my grandmother's generation, for instance, in Turkey, they had this belief that if you educate your children, if they have more education than you've had, they will have a better life. Nobody believes in that anymore. So that's the one thing that we have lost. You might have a great education. We don't know. The job market is changing. Is the education that we're having now going to be relevant 50 years now or 30 years from now? So this uncertainty, I think, makes it very important that at a moment like this, we talk about negative emotions openly, honestly, but try to turn them into something more constructive, positive, both for ourselves individually, but also for our societies and communities. And the only way to do that is by connecting. You know, isolationism, tribalism, nationalism is not the answer to global challenges.
Henri, is it unreasonable to feel this extreme angst and anxiety? I mean, I understand exactly the point that Elif has just made, and it feels true that perhaps this difference is that we haven't, you know, each generation can't sort of accept that the next generation will do better and the world will be better for them. So that it's the foundations of our basic idea of progress are collapsing. Is that right? Should we be that worried?
You are right, Raphael, on 2 points. Number one, about progress, we live probably the first time in the history of modernity since 2,000 years, in which the idea that tomorrow will be better than today has more or less disappeared. Few people believe in that. It's the first time. All the eschatology, all the secular messianisms, all the philosophies of history were based on the idea that whatever are the sorrows of the present, tomorrow will be better than today. First time in which this idea has disappeared. You are right on a second point, which is to compare the crisis of democracy of today to 1910 and 1920. It is true, 1930. It is true that we are living the third crisis of liberal values since 1 century. It is the third time it happens. Ideas of democracy, of enlightenment, of human rights have been under attack 3 times, 2 times in the past, and it is the third time today. This is absolutely exact. The third crisis of liberal values. Now the question is, and you are right, what is the peculiarity of the crisis in which we are living? It is not the 30s, it is not the 10s. Why? For me, there is 2 peculiarities in the 2 singularities, 2 specificities in the crisis we are facing. Number one, the rise, the new balance of power in the world. The West, who more or less embody part of the liberal values is on retreat, is retreating, and you have some revisionist powers, not one like Germany of the 30s, not 2 like in the Soviet Union, but you have a reasonable number, 4 or 5 revisionist powers who are renoding themselves with their own imperial dream and trying to occupy the space. You have Putin, who is reviving and trying to revive the grand slave dream. You have China, with the new Chinese empire. You have Iranian with the revival of the Persian Empire. You have some extremist Muslim countries led by Qatar who pretend to extend the Ummah, and you have the neo-Ottoman dream of Erdogan. This is new. It's the first time where you have, in front of those who defend liberal and democratic values, 5 strong powers who are asserting their strength, expanding their space, and reconnecting with their own imperial dream. Singularity number 1. Singularity number 2 of the current crisis compared to the one of the 30s and the one of the 10th is that I think that we never saw in the West, in the Western democracy, such a huge egoism, lack of brotherhood, and enclosement in our fortress and boundaries. Never to this extent. This is the purpose of the book which I publish in a few weeks. I try to prove by acts of brotherhood, but I know that this idea is completely out of focus today. And the COVID did not arrange the situation. During the COVID, we were told in all our countries, please to be safe and to keep your people and friends safe, you have to be retreating, you have to be alone, you have to enclose yourself. So there is a general mood in the West who consists in caring as little as possible for the others, is to abandon the field of brotherhood and fraternity, to erase the old and beautiful tradition of what the generation of my fathers and your grandfathers called internationalism. Today, internationalism, a universality of the rights, has become like a bad word. So, for the first time, to this extent, there is this very strange movement of shrinking all the part of our culture which is directed at connecting with the others, caring about them, sharing their sorrow. This is new in the current crisis of liberal democracy.
To what, I mean, I have potentially a rebuttal to that view. I share instinctively that view, but there is, I think, another more optimistic way of looking at this, which is, if you think of this generation that we're talking about, that they are very individualist and maybe even online narcissistic, and you've written very well about this culture, and consumer-driven in many respects, but unlike the 1910s and unlike the 1920s, they're not militaristic, they're not in arms. There is a kind of a softness and all the interconnectedness that makes it almost impossible to imagine mobilizing people the way in their millions for an aggressive project of fascism or nationalism like you could in the 1930s. You've written about the problems, the selfishness and the narcissism that makes it hard to connect people. And reading that, I did find myself thinking, what if actually this is just each generation looking at the next generation and thinking, the kids, they don't know anything. That always happens. What if the kids are all right? What if actually it's great that this new society is actually, they're not going to basically rise up and tear everything down? Is there an upside?
we want to find hope, right?
Yeah,
definitely. No, I hear you. I mean, I jokingly think I can't be very optimistic. I'm Turkish, it's not in my DNA. Because I think as you follow the river Danube from Germany towards the Black Sea, by the time you reach Bulgaria, Romania, Turkey, the level of optimism drops and drops and drops. So pessimism is easier, but I hear you. We need some healthy dose of optimism as well, but that hope is going to come from our fellow human beings. I mean, the fact that here we are, we come from different backgrounds, different cultures, we share similar concerns, we hear each other, we connect. whatever you call this, you call it love, you call it sisterhood, you call it solidarity, internationalism, whatever that thing is, it is stronger than hatred. And we can never lose sight of it. However, I also think it's a time to be worried. We have to be worried because we haven't benefited at all from this extreme optimism that led eventually to some kind of complacency. Because eventually, if things are going to get better, if democracy is the only way, why bother? One thing that worries me is, for instance, again, going back to Turkey, we always retained in Turkey this belief that we were part of Europe. Europeans had a different view about us, but we saw ourselves as Europeans, right, or part of Europe. That no longer is the ideal. Democracy is no longer the ideal. Just the opposite. You hear this narrative about actually China is doing quite well. There are other models, and maybe those models are better. All across the Middle East, more and more people are saying, maybe it doesn't suit our national character. Democracy is a European thing. So the universality, the appeal of democracy is lost. And that's one thing that really worries me. And the second thing is, that's why I slightly disagree with what you said. It's not only, of course, people are not as partisan at the moment, although there is a generational difference. Let us not forget that. But I think what worries me most is, among all the emotions that we talked, I don't see anxiety, fear, uncertainty as necessarily a bad thing, as long as we can turn them into something positive. So I have a positive view on pessimism. What can we do with that is what I care about. But there's one emotion that really scares me, and that is the lack of all emotions. The moment we become numb. If I stop caring about what's happening in Afghanistan, to women, to minorities, to youth, to LGBTQ+, if it doesn't register, if enough number of people stop caring, that kind of, when we become desensitized. And I think it's quite relevant because when you read the memoirs of people who have survived the darkest chapters in human history, including the Holocaust, I think the survivors are warning us about this. Terrible things happen not because many people are evil, but enough number of people become indifferent, desensitized, disconnected. So how do we become engaged? How do we care is going to be one of our biggest challenges.
I mean, you know Afghanistan very well, and I think many of us watched what happened over this summer and felt that between 2001 and 2021, those are 20 years that have they disappeared completely into the memory hole, into the abyss, that there was progress and there was an intervention and it failed. And I'd probably be interested to hear your response to this idea that what's missing now is almost an available beacon that you could make of Western democracy. Because particularly when Donald Trump was elected president in the US. So, we will talk about the idea of Europe, but the idea of Europe feels especially besieged because actually the idea of Europe had a sort of a brother in the American Republic and the idea of the US Constitution. And if we lose that, and you see now, obviously many European leaders, but Macron leading among them, thinking we can no longer rely on the US to be what it was in the 20th century.
What is great in American Dream was the idea of resuming Europe, reinventing it, and making Europe, a second Europe, better. This was the dream of the founding fathers. They were all readers of Virgil, the story of a guy who flies from Troya in flames and who founds Roma. And the founding fathers of America, maybe till John Fitzgerald Kennedy, had the idea that America was inhabited by people who escaped not Troya, but all Europe, in flames, not by fire, but by intolerance, bigotry, and so on, and building another Europe better than the original one. This was the great part of American Dream. Which is true is that we entered into an era, not only since Trump, much before, in which this link, this holy link in a way, between this link of values, let's say, between Europe and America has been broken or is in the process of being broken. This is the first thing. Second thing, what frightens me, as you say, is indifference. This, for me, is the worst in America and in Europe. Okay, we don't have huge mobs of people following a new fascism. Maybe, except that you have mobs on internet, you have mobs on Twitter. She knows better than anyone. I know a little. The power of these new mobs who are electronic fascists, but fascists nevertheless. You know, as a lady, I know sometimes as a Jew. It is not comparable, but it has also its harm. But what is terrible is the indifference for, on the good side. I take one example. I started my last book with a trip in Nigeria, in Africa. You have in Nigeria a huge phenomenon, a huge event happening today, which is a massacre on large scale of Christians by extremist and radical Islamists, Boko Haram and others. I went there. I made a reportage on that, on the ground. I reported stories, narratives, events. I filmed all of that. I demonstrated that we were at the edge in Nigeria, in front of Boko Haram and their affiliates, of maybe, I hope not, a new Rwanda. I brought the story back. I made as much noise as I could about it. In the French press, American press, my reportage was published in the Wall Street Journal, for example, which is not completely a student newspaper. I expected, I don't know, a minimum of solidarity. I expected an insurrection of consciousness, especially among the Christians in France, in America, the neo-evangelic, who pretend to care about Christianity. Very little. And this is what frightens me more. When someone, a whistleblower, an intellectual acting as a whistleblower, warns about a possible genocide, not yet, but at the edge, in the biggest country in Africa, committed against Christians, their fellow Christians honestly react with a very strange coolness and indifference. And this might be one of the plagues of modern democracies.
I have hearing that, and I read the reportage from Nigeria, and it's shocking, it's harrowing, it's upsetting. And it occurs to me now, thinking about it, that maybe, in a sense, and this speaks to your point about numbness, there is something in 21st century culture where people feel threatened by negative emotion to such an extent, and there are so many other distractions that when you're confronted with the horrors that are described so well in the book, you just think, this is an assault. This offends me that you're making me see this thing. And there are so many other ways that I can actually turn myself that I don't need. It's almost, I feel, attacked by the horror of it. And I don't know how you then connect that to a moral call to action as opposed to a consumer urge to go and find, to go into the sweetie drawer and just have something nicer tasting to eat.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
I do see what you mean. I also say, I mean, in connection with all this, I think we're suffering from an information fatigue because we're constantly consuming these snippets of information. You know, just 2 sentences about something that happened in Venezuela, 2 sentences about something that happened in Egypt. We scroll it up and down. The thing is, I think we live in a world that is bombarded with information, let alone misinformation, in which we have way too much information. We can't even process it, but we have very little knowledge and even less wisdom. So I make a distinction between information, knowledge, and wisdom. We don't need this much information. It creates an illusion and the arrogance that we know something about the subject. You can ask me anything, you know. If I don't know the answer, I can Google it. in the next 5 minutes, I'll be able to tell you a few things, you know, giving me the impression that I know something about the subject. I know nothing about that subject. So what we have forgotten is primarily to say, I don't know. I mean, when was the last time we ever said, I don't know about anything? I find this very problematic. We forgot our own ignorance. You know, where are the areas where I know nothing? You know, in which areas I need to do more? So let us focus more on knowledge, not this much on information. For knowledge, I think we need books. We need to slow down. You cannot rush knowledge. We need investigative journalism, in-depth analysis, you know, documentaries. And ultimately, we need wisdom, which requires emotional intelligence. So coming back to emotions, I think that is where, for wisdom, we need to bring the heart and the mind together. Where I come from, in Turkey, people think women are emotional, men are not. That is nonsense, right? As human beings, we're all emotional. And what we remember through stories and emotions. What stays with us, Maya Angelou was right. You know, people will forget what you say. They will never forget how you made them feel. So we do connect through emotions and feelings. And the problem is, populist demagogues understand this power of emotions far better than their liberal counterparts. And that is quite scary. So let's talk about emotions, our own fears, anxieties. Let's create public spaces where we can have nuanced conversations. That's why these cultural spaces are so important. Let's hear each other, but we have to go beyond our own echo chambers. It is not a coincidence that all the demagogues that you mentioned, including Erdogan, they benefit from extreme polarization, including Trump. There's a reason why they love this us versus them. So I think as people who believe in pluralistic democracy, one of our biggest challenges is going to be, how do you communicate with people who might have voted differently, who think differently? So it comes back to language, and I think words have incredible power at a moment like this.
Can I just stay with you for a moment, because also this leads to something I've wanted to ask you about what you can communicate with fiction that you can't with non-fiction, which seems to touch exactly on this, that you can create an emotional connection, and the unwritten or the undeclared contract of a work of fiction is you're inviting someone into your imagination, but you have no control over what they do with it or how they understand it. And because it's fiction, you don't really get to say, this is a correct understanding of what I've written. Once you've given it to, and I'm sure some of these people here will be here because of your fiction, and they have their own version of that truth. And so going back to your very interesting and important point, I think, about just knowing what you don't know and how you reach out in ignorance to make connections, is that something that fiction can achieve that reportage can't achieve?
I think reportage achieves a tremendous amount of connectivity as well. But because I'm a storyteller, I'm interested in both stories and silences. Not only the things we talk about, but also untold stories. But if I may give you a very quick example, for instance, in Turkey, I have many readers actually who are very xenophobic or very judgmental, especially towards minorities. So if you ask their opinions about Armenians, about Jews, about Greeks, Kurds, Alevis, because these are the main minorities in Turkey, they will tell you all kinds of stereotypes. Equally, I have many readers who are very homophobic or transphobic, again, because this is the only narrative they heard at school, in their house, in their family. But then the same people, they come and they say, I read your book, and this is the character that I love the most, and they get upset at me because I haven't given that character a better ending. And maybe the fictional character they're talking about is Armenian, or Jewish, or Greek, or gay, or bisexual. So all I'm trying to say is, because we're always part of this collective identity in our daily life, the novel doesn't do that. It makes us an individual. We go to an inner garden. When you become an individual, there's a bigger potential to connect with your other and to realize that actually the other is my brother, the other is my sister. I am the other. I am like the other. We're not that different. So it does rehumanize people who have been dehumanized. I find that important.
And this is an interesting phenomenon, isn't it? The compartmentalization, the idea that people can understand, identify with an individual, and then, as you say, not kind of extrapolate from that to an understanding of solidarity on the human level. I mean, just a small story. I lived in Moscow for many years, and I had a landlady, and she, was a student then, and we got on very well, and we drank lots of vodka and had great fun. One day I came home, I'd been at a demonstration, and it was a demonstration of the far right, an organization called Russian Unity. And I brought home their newspaper, and their newspaper was absolute neo-Nazi stuff. You know, it was all about the Jews trying to undermine Russia, trying to flood Russia with foreigners, to dilute the Russian genes, you know, the usual sort of stuff. Mad conspiracy theories about how Boris Yeltsin's real name was Baruch Yeltsin, wow. And Mikhail Gorbachev's real name was Moishe Solomonovich Gorbachev, and they were all Jews, and you know. Anyway, I took this newspaper and I put it in the bin. And then the next day, I found that my landlady had taken it out of the bin and was reading it. And I said to her, this is crazy, isn't it? Crazy stuff. And she said, well, some of this makes a lot of sense. And I said, well, you don't believe all that stuff about Jews. And she said, oh, Jews are no good. You're okay. Don't take it personally. You're one of the good ones, but the Jews are no good. So, you know, you deal with these brilliant individual stories, and you find the individual humanity, and then there seems to be this huge gulf that we need to try and build the bridge to the idea that you can then organize solidarity. It's a huge question, but how do we build that bridge? What does that bridge look like?
There is two replies. Number one, it's not uneasy, it's not impossible to destroy the conspiracy theories. First part of your question. Conspiracy theories are strong because they are the only ideologies which remain, solid and consistent ideologies, but they are weak, they are stupid, and they can be unbuilt rather easily, first of all. Second, how to convince people of being, of feeling sisterhood and brotherhood. This is your question. Many ways, but one of them is to convince them that it is their interest. Because I deeply believe, myself, after a life of reportage, of traveling all over the world, after a life of going to difficult places, I did draw the conclusion that we live in a very small planet, and that this planet is completely interconnected. If we live, for example, if we accept that Erdogan imprisons his journalists, destroys the Kurds, invades Rojava in the way we did, if we allow him to go to the end of his target, what is the result? It will embolden, it will encourage, it will give strength to those who, in UK or in France, believe like Erdogan, are sometimes manipulated by Erdogan. It will give them some additional force. And for the lady or the gentleman you are describing, which is in front of his TV, saying, I'm just going to have my pizza and so on, it will be very bad. He will have maybe terrorist attacks. He will have some attacks at the building close to his against opponents of Erdogan, and so on. And this is true for all these. Putin, for example. People can believe. I went in Donbass, in Ukraine, on the front line between Ukraine and Russia. You can think it's not of our business. You can believe that it is a question of the Crimea and of the... It is not true. The stronger Putin is, the more decided and determined he will be to undermine our elections, to create some troubles in UK at the moment of the Brexit debate, in France at the moment of the next Macron election, and so on. So these guys, if we don't care about them and about their enemies, they will care about us. And it is always it costs more to let Erdogan Muslim Brotherhood, Iran, China, and Putin act freely, it costs more to leave them do that than to prevent them, than to oppose some strong diplomatic act and to oppose a sisterhood and a brotherhood with their victims, with their opponents who happen to be sharing values similar to ours. In terms of cost, of benefit, it costs more not to do nothing, not to care, than to care. This we can say to the people you are mentioning.
I hope that would work. My concern is that if you are Putin and what you're promising to do, with some success, is to make people who felt the loss of the Soviet Union as shameful and literally a shrinking of their country. They lost Ukraine. They lost superpower status. And he said, you can feel proud to be Russian. I'll make you strong again. And Erdogan, the same in Turkey. And the idea of nationhood that people, we've seen it in this country, you see it in France, is a very historically resonant, powerful thing. It animates people's emotions. You quote this very famous line from Jean-Marie Le Pen, who says, I prefer my daughter to my cousin to my neighbor to, because solidarity, the further you get from yourself and the people around you, the more abstract it becomes.
I don't think so. It doesn't work like this. We have not time to enter into detail, but I really believe that this sentence is not true, that solidarity obeys to other laws. And about Putin and the greatness of Russia, you will be surprised one day. Same for Turkey. The number of people, some believe in Navalny, some believe in the heritage of the dissidents of the 80s, whatever. You will be surprised one day by the number of people who don't dare at this minute, because it is dangerous, to express their intimate revolt against this authoritarian, stupid, vulgar regime of Putin, who did not dare and who one day will express. I remember in 1987-88, most of people in the West, I was there, I was in the debate, believed that the dissidents were a handful, very small, that of course we had to defend them for moral reasons, but that it made no sense. They will never win. The idea of the Soviet Empire appeared to be eternal. A few months after, millions of Soviets and Eastern Europeans voted with their feet, broke the curtain of iron, and went to democracy. So history is always surprising. And the silent majorities sometimes are better and more generous than we believe from far.
Okay, so we found some optimism. Can you apply that in Turkey? Or can we feel...
I think, maybe one thing we haven't talked about is identity. How do we describe ourselves? How do we define ourselves? And that also could be a source of hope, because instead of believing in singular identities, if we can encourage this notion of multiple belongings. And I think this is the right time to do it, because with the climate crisis, with the pandemic, when everything shows that we are interconnected, we are constantly pushed into a duality. That's the way populism works. It tells us that you are either someone who loves their country, or you're a global elite, right? You're part of the global elite. We don't have to be trapped in this duality. There are other ways of thinking. And I think as human beings, like Walt Whitman used to say, we all contain multitudes. So if we can encourage that, the problem is we live in a world that doesn't allow us to be multiple, that doesn't allow us to celebrate our own inner pluralism. So of course I'm Turkish. I'm very attached to Istanbul. I think it's very visible in my work. But I also feel attached to the Balkans. I have elements in my soul from the Middle East. I do consider myself European. I did become a Londoner, a British citizen, over the years. And despite this Brexit saga, I want to call myself a citizen of the world. That doesn't mean you're a citizen of nowhere. So if we can have concentric circles rather than monolithic identities, then you realize it's also in my interest because I have attachments regionally, internationally, globally. I am not just one single thread of identity. I think that's another narrative, that more fluid and pluralistic narrative.
Yeah, because you've written very well about the idea of a motherland, and I think you described it once as a castle made of crystal that when you leave and it breaks, you can forget about it, but then you still have the shards and then you remember. It's a very powerful image. But rereading that before this event, I wondered about whether Europe can be that thing for people. Again, your point, I hope you're right about solidarity reaching out to a silent majority where you can have, I mean, lots of people will have European identities, Jewish identities, Londoner, all these various things, as you say. But you spent time in Libya, and you know, and being French, you know better than many Europeans that this tension between the idea that there is a southern border to Europe, which is the Mediterranean. And actually, you know, over hundreds of years, the Mediterranean was all Europe. The southern North Africa was part of our sort of space as well. But now we have this idea of Europe that says, no, they're the other, they're Muslim, that's the border now. Turkey as well. This is now southern, peripheral to Europe, different to Europe. With Brexit, Britain now becomes peripheral to an idea of Europe. This is a huge question now, but how are we to sort of rehabilitate an idea of Europe that's open, as distinct from the political project that is the European Union, which is exclusive?
I don't know if it has to be rehabilitated. It exists, and thanks God, we are numerous, including in UK, to believe that Europe is our fatherland, that we are numerous, and also those who lost Brexit in UK, but who believe in that they are European, of English origin, of Scottish origin, of French origin, of Polish origin. We are European, which means two things. Number one, that the proper place to discuss the democratic issues is no longer little England, little France, little Germany, but is a larger agora, as the Greeks said. If you want to discuss seriously the question of migrants, the question of ecology, the question of financial criminality and so on, you cannot discuss it at the scale of a single nation. You have to discuss it at the scale of the big agora. And number two, the values which are part of the democratic dream and practice, they are values due to John Locke, Goethe, Voltaire, and so many different people of Europe. They are stemming from Europe as itself. There is very few of the values composing the democratic system which can be considered as having their origin in UK only, in France only, in Germany only, in Turkey only. Europe is all of that. The western part of Turkey, UK, France, the Greek mythology, a young princess flying from, taking the sea from Lebanon, a Turkish princess flying, taking sea from Lebanon, arriving in Crete or in Greece after that. This is Europe. This is the big space of which we are the children, daughters, and sons.
Do you feel that you can be patriotic about this an idea when patria, the root of this word, is traditionally understood as a place, but you know there is this feeling I think many people have now of a kind of exile. Again, you've written about this. It's not doesn't always have to be a geographical thing. Do you feel exiled from your motherland, your homeland? To what idea, if any, can you feel patriotism?
It's a tough question. I think exile, to be an immigrant, also I feel like I'm an immigrant in this language. I write in English, and as you can hear in my accent, I wasn't, brought up in a bilingual house. So English for me is an acquired language. And as immigrants or as exiles, you never forget that there's a gap between the mind and the tongue. The mind always runs faster and the tongue tries to catch up. And that gap is actually quite frustrating, but it can also be inspiring. I guess what I'm trying to say is, particularly with exile, there is a certain melancholy. There is a sense of absence. There's a sense of loss and longing. And that is a very emotional thing that will always come with you. And it will hit you at unexpected moments, like the smell of something like sesame bagels, roasted chestnuts, small things. But then at the same time, there's a richness to, I'm a big believer in diversity. There was a time when multiculturalism was a good word, no longer. There was a time when being cosmopolitan was a good word, no longer. So we have just discarded all these words. I think in life we learn from differences. And that's what challenges us. So I do believe that in the kind of Europe that is not, again, monolithic, but the kind of Europe that also has Ibn Arabi as its part of intellectual tradition, the kind of Europe that celebrates its own minorities, its own diversity, Afro-Europeans and also LGBTQ minorities. So lots and lots of, pluralism in its own history and present moment, that kind of fluid. But most importantly, are we as citizens of this planet? Can I also connect with people miles and continents away? That is something that I can feel very patriotic about. So all I'm trying to say is you can have strong local attachments and even be proud of the ancestors' cultures and care about your grandparents' stories, and at the same time care about refugees, at the same time care about the future of the world. We don't have to accept this dualistic, way of thinking that populist demagoguery constantly pushes us into.
Well, can I just say before we go to questions that Joseph Conrad and Vladimir Nabokov demonstrate that sometimes coming to English as a second language and writing that language is a route to a different and a superior understanding of the capabilities of the language, and I think you very much belong in that category. So I think people will, in this audience will recognize that. We have time for some questions. I've got loads more questions, but I'm not going to be greedy. Are there roving microphones, or are we expecting people to shout? Oh, we can even bring the house lights up a little bit. And I even have an iPad. Someone's brought me some questions. Right, so while there's somewhat shy audience thinks about their questions.
There's one question.
Oh, there is. Oh, that was not shy at all. I can't see probably. So let's, could we take up a little batch? So there's a lady here in the stripy top. And then a gentleman in the leather jacket at the front there. And if we can keep them brief, then we can get lots of things.
So my question was about Afghanistan, and in particular, not just the role of individuals, but of the role of Western powers such as America, because in some respects, that was potentially, you could argue, a policy started by Trump, but then enacted by Biden. So my question is, where is hope in that, in terms of how Western powers will behave with respect to how it's happened in Afghanistan?
And let's take two questions, and then we won't have to keep backwards and forwards.
Thank you. I'm Dastan from the Iraqi Kurdistan, and in 2017, Bernard was there when we tried to do the referendum, and because of that, I think everyone in Kurdistan know you because of that. So my question is that you were there, like we tried to do that, the most democratic process to decide on our fate for independency, and we saw that no one even supported us, because at that time Kurds think that from West, maybe we will have some support from UK, from France, from US, but when we did that and no one supported us, and then the conflict happened of Kirkuk, Sinjar, and all of that places have been taken by the Iraqi government. So why is that happen? Like, why no one even supported that democratic process in that region? And all the talks that you talked about, like, I can relate it so much, because like we have Russia in Rojava, like the Turkey government is bombing our border, like from Iran. So five powers like Russia, Iran, and Turkey is active in my regions, like in Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, and in Rojava. So why like there is no support for that small region in there? Okay. And for Alif, just one comment that she talked about the identity. Why it's not acceptable like for Kurds in Turkey to have like they are a Turkish citizen, but why like their Kurdish identity is not acceptable? Like why for them it's not allowed to like speak in Kurdish? Because like I love Istanbul. When I go there, like I hope that to hear more like Kurmanji people, but it's not there as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So, Bernard-Henri, why don't you start? There was Afghanistan, and then the question of why when you had something that was containable that you could get hold of in Kurdistan, why even then was that not lifted up?
About Afghanistan, it is true that it was the project was Trump, and it was enacted by Biden. It was a joint venture by both, and this is not the least sad part of the story. And it's very sad because, number one, it weakened America a lot. America lost a big part of its credibility. To betray one's allies and friends is a big crime and a big mistake, and nobody believes you again. And if I were a citizen of Taiwan, for example, I don't know if I would believe still in the word of America. It was very sad what happened in Afghanistan also because there were a lot of people, especially women, who believed in us. Everybody says it did not work in Afghanistan. America had to withdraw because it did not work. It is not true. It did work. I was in Afghanistan many times since 40 years, especially after the first war against Taliban and recently. The difference was huge. The number of women who did conquer the right of being equal as the right of acting as equal was incredible. So it worked. Not perfectly. The state was corrupted and so on, but a civil society took birth with the help, with the support, with the encouragement of the West. So it is sad because all these hopes of the civil society in Afghanistan were deceived and betrayed. What is the hope today in Afghanistan? The hope resides in those, especially ladies, who defy the iron fist of the Taliban, who descend in the streets in Herat, in Kandahar, in other cities, and who demonstrate and ask their right to go to school and to be equal of the men. So this is a source of hope. And another source of hope is the few handful of Afghans in the area of Panjshir, which was the birthplace of the former commander Massoud, who is still resisting to the order of Taliban. So the ladies of Herat and the fighter of Panjshir, these are the two sources of hope for Afghanistan. About the Kurds, for me, it is one of the big sorrows of my life to see the bravery, the courage, the devotion to democratic values with which the Kurds did fight with us, the Westerners, shoulder to shoulder against ISIS, and to see how, when we Westerners believed that the job was finished, we dropped them flat. This is a real sorrow for a number of people in Europe, including myself. I was there on the field during the referendum in Iraqi Kurdistan. I was there just after the invasion of Rojava by proxies of Turkey who have committed huge crime, war crimes and crimes against humanity. And honestly, I think I never cried as much as when I was with the lady fighters of Rojava, who did fought with such bravery with us, for themselves, for rights, against the dictatorship of Erdogan, and who were abandoned for the rest, abandoned by the rest of the world. So today, I try to call for help for them. I try to convince my fellow citizens of Europe that it is their creed, it should be their creed, and it is their interest not to leave to their dark destiny the young ladies and the gentlemen, like the General Masloum Kobané in Rojava, like the General Barzani and his people in KRG, who continue to fight against ISIS, against Turkey, and against Iranian militias. We have the same enemies. They are the sentinels of a world of freedom, which is not only the world of the West, which is a common world in which all those who are worth the word of humanity are part.
Elif, there was a specific question there about the Kurds and the relationship with Turkey, but because we're short on time, I'm also going to add on a question that we've had online from Tom, who's asked, what gives you the most hope in the world today? Because I think we would be good to go from the specific to then draw it back out towards the end of our session to something that will enable us to raise our heads to the horizon a little bit.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I hear your words, and of course, in Turkey we have a big Kurdish minority, and we still have not recognized their right to have education in their mother tongue. You will know Harold Pinter's very famous play. You know, there was a long time when Kurdish language was regarded as a mountain language, not even a language in itself. Even when it was recognized as a language, there are people who say it's not sophisticated enough. You know, all these biases. Just to give you an example, I never forget many years ago, when I first went to Hay Festival for the first time, I had to stop by a road sign because for the first time I saw a road sign in Welsh and English together. In Turkey, that's unthinkable, but why not? Why can't you have Kurdish and Turkish, you know, words, the names, the places? So I hear you, but for that, again, it comes back to identity. Can we have a supranational identity that connects us to something that is beyond one kind of nationalism? In Turkey, we haven't been, unfortunately, able to celebrate our own diversity. And I don't think it's a coincidence when you lose democracy, the appreciation for diversity, for pluralism, also goes backwards. With regards to Afghanistan, just very few words, it really breaks my heart. You know, this notion of realpolitik that tells us if you want to make good omelets, you're going to crack, you know, break a few eggs, and those eggs are always women and minorities. So in the grand scheme of things, Afghan women are casualties, Afghan minorities are casualties, human rights in Afghanistan are casualties. And I'm very critical of this dualistic way of thinking. That pendulum, we swing from one extreme to another, either this neocon arrogance that says, you know, we go and we build their democracy for them, or the other end that says, oh, we have nothing to do, it's their problem, you know, it's not our problem, so why do we get involved? Is that it? We have only two options. As humanity, we've only come up with two options. We have a responsibility to Afghan women, to human rights defenders, to minorities. I don't believe that Taliban have changed. And it really breaks my heart to read these articles. I read in Turkish newspapers articles talking about the fashion, the elegance of Taliban style. How ready are we to believe that Taliban have changed? This is an extremist version of religion, you know. How can they change? So I think human to human we have a responsibility. And as global citizens, we have to find those channels of connection, which brings us perhaps back to hope. I think this is a crossroads. You know, Gramsci has this important essay in which he talks about how the old world is gone and the new world is not born yet. And I think we are in that moment of in between them. So when people ask with good intentions, when are we going to go back to the way things were before, back to the normal? We're not going back to the normal. And that wasn't normal anyway. What we can do is focus on this crossroads and hopefully build a better world. But for that, we need to be aware of inequalities. We need to be aware of silences who are not invited to the table. We do have a responsibility towards each other. So I think it's a moment of rethinking, reckoning, what are my values in life? Do I want more money, more greed, more rush, constantly rushing from one thing to another? Or is it actually more immaterial things that really make sense, like love, like friendship, like sisterhood, but also connecting with nature at a time when we're losing our planet? So if we make the right choices at a crossroads like this, there is a potential and we can make a difference. We have to get rid of this thought that I'm so little, climate change is so big, what can I do? Pandemic is so big, what can I change? The moment we enter into that kind of apathy, we won't change anything. But if we connect, we can change lots of things together.
Now, we're technically out of time, but I just want to smuggle in one last question because that's come online from Angelica, because it's a way to invite you, Henri, to also answer the question about hope and being optimistic. The question is, essentially, have we become unshockable? You've done this reportage, you've presented people with things that should shock them into action. What if that numbness has killed the nerve endings that mean we don't feel the shock? I don't think you think that is true, and therefore, what gives you hope that the nerves can still be activated and people can be pushed into action?
What gives me hope is those who keep hope in desperate place. I visited last year so many places of sorrow, of mourning, of misery, so many places where pure hell. I spent time, for example, in Mogadishu, in Somalia, which is really which looks like a cursed place, a place of damnation. Which gives me hope is that even in these places, you have some solidarity links. You have some remnants of civil society. You have some young ladies, young men, and somebody not so young who continue believing in humanistic values. And the fact that under this iron curtain of despair, that the flame of humanity continues to burn, this is what gives me hope. And one last example, I spent some time in one of the worst places I ever saw, which was the refugee camp of Lesbos during COVID, when even the humanitarian workers were very few because of contamination and so on. I spent time there with a film crew, and again, the solidarity existing between these people who did escape war, who took terrible risk in order to arrive in Europe, who did not have the slightest idea of what could be their destiny, who saw Europeans closing arms instead of embracing them or opening arms at least, and who nevertheless kept hope in humanity. This filled me with hope.
Well, that's the ideal note on which to finish. And I've got a red flashing sign here telling me that we're definitely out of time. So I'm sorry if anyone's going to miss their bus or train as a result, but I couldn't just stop without at least finding some way to blow on the embers of despair that we were looking at and rekindle exactly this flame of hope, which to my mind is demonstrated by the fact that we are here and people want to listen and speak and read the books and share their opinions and disagree or agree, but do it with civility, which leads me to my very last duty, which is to say, Bernard-Henri Lévy, merci beaucoup, Elif Shafak, teşekkür ederim. Thank you. And I think we can probably show our appreciation the usual way.
Thank you, Elif.